He was so many times called a Renaissance man because he was a Renaissance man.
You must get your hands dirty in politics because the politics has to go right in order for culture to be possible.
Great culture doesn't thrive in the gulag. It doesn't thrive in an oppressive society. It prospers in a free society. Well, the thing about Bill, when I first got to know him through National Review, reading National Review, was just how Catholic his taste was. He was a person who could find quality in anything. He was the anti-snob. He found quality in all kinds of art, all kinds of music. He had strong likes and dislikes, but he was just a very worldly thinker. That's the first thing that I think about when I think about Bill.
I absolutely agree. I think that my experiences with Bill and playing at his home was that he was able to bring people together from different walks of life to listen to the great music that he listened to as a child at Great Elm, in this home, in this environment that was very rarefied in a way because his parents and his father especially wanted them to enjoy and experience the greatness of Western civilization. So if it manifested itself in a listening room every week with a Cape Heart record player playing Beethoven, Mozart, Verdi for the children, at first they looked at it and they said, why are we doing this? They didn't understand. They were looking outside. They were looking at everyone, the beautiful weather. But then after 6 months, 8 months, they realized, there is something else here. There's this amazing music. There's something so otherworldly here. And it fit that kind of mold for him and shaped him for his entire life.
Yeah, it's interesting that if you have a grounding in the culture, if you have a grounding in music and literature and art and much more, then it starts off in this thing, what you're defending, which is incredibly important for somebody who's then interested in politics remotely. Is you have a sort of hinterland. And that seems to me one of the things that Buckley had. He had this extraordinary hinterland. He knew that politics was important, but he knew that culture was where you could really look to, something to defend, something to aspire to.
I absolutely agree. I mean, one time I asked Bill a political question at a dinner party. He looked at me and he said, politics is my vocation, not my avocation. So I think that spoke volumes about where his priorities were. That the magazine was both politics and culture, but after hours, it was culture. It was something that he wanted to.
And how did you two meet?
Well, we met because I wrote him a letter 30 years ago, which
You were a teenager.
I was a teenager.
When you wrote it.
I was 18 years old, and I wrote him a letter thanking him for having emboldened Soviet Jews. My parents came from the Soviet Union to come to America to make it here. And I wanted to play a piano recital for him as a thank you present. So you have to imagine the kind of person who would reply to this. And I knew he loved classical music, and he replied to my letter, invited me to play at 73rd Street at his house, at his incredible maisonette, on his Bösendorfer piano, which I did about 6 months later.
What did you play?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing.
So I played Bach Prelude and Fugue in C-sharp minor from Book 1 because I knew he loved Bach. And I played a Debussy work, L'Île Joyeuse, and I played a Liszt Etude, Chasse-Neige. And we had 1 hour at the Maisonette. And it was a Narnian door that opened for me. It was this world that I had never imagined, that I only read about in books or in magazines or saw in movies. And here was this great man standing there, but he was completely normal. It was not, this incredible figure that you saw on television and were intimidated by in some way, right? A patrician type of individual. But he was very comfortable in his own skin human being who welcomed me, a Jewish kid from St. Paul, studying at a conservatory in New York, into his home.
Well, he was open to all comers. He was the kind of guy that if he saw the phone was ringing, he would he would be open to the risk of answering it without knowing who was on the other line.
I think that
So he was a risk taker. He was a cultural risk taker.
he was a
also.
cultural, that is such a great point. He was a cultural risk taker, and he was someone who, when he received a letter, I believe that this was one of his greatest virtues. He received a letter, and he felt a responsibility for writing back. That a person took time to contact him, and he was going to reply to that person. Maybe he's not interested. Or he would think so quickly about, there's a dot I can connect here. And it was an incredible quality in this
Or
man.
there's a person that I could connect this person to, because he was a big networker. And I think when he looked at art, it always came back to some roots that he had. As he and I once talked about Spanish art, which he didn't know a great deal about academically. He wasn't an art historian. But for him, it was very expressive of the Roman Catholic vision. He knew who the saints were, which most people now don't. But he had a natural empathy with religious art that came from his heart and his soul. That was something that you don't expect someone from the political world, which I knew him from the political world, someone to have. The people in politics are, in my experience, unusually dense when it comes to art. They're very bottom line people. But Bill was a very spiritual person, and that to me was reflected in his taste in art. Now, music, you know a lot about, which I don't.
Yeah.
So
I would
it's
say,
different.
I would say in music, of course, his starting point and end point was Bach in so many ways. For him, he was the architect. He was the god of music, really. And for Bill, any opportunity he had, he wanted to include Bach. There were other composers, but if you look back at Firing Line, there's Rosalind Turek. This man dedicated an entire episode, numerous episodes, to Bach. And Rosalind Turek, at that time, the great harpsichordist and pianist, playing Bach on PBS. And if we think about the ramifications of that, this was a 3 or 4 channel universe that we lived in. Today we can't really relate to that. So having a program dedicated to Bach for millions of people to experience with a great pianist, this was something that he did consciously, right? So he wanted to expose the public to this, and then he'd write about it in a column, and then he would write about it in a book. So he took advantage of all of his platforms, and I think this goes to art, this goes to so many other things. When he was passionate about something, he would find a way to disseminate it through his world, through all of his tentacles.
Well, he would have agreed when the Americans were sending up spaceships, and there was a discussion before they could send up humans. There was an agreement that there should be a representation from each of the art forms that the human species had come up with, and there was a discussion about which piece of music to send up into outer space so it could be discovered by an alien species to see what we've been doing down here. And somebody said, well, of course, if it's a piece of music, it has to be Bach. And one of the other participants said, no, that would look like showing off.
Well, I'm sure nobody suggested sending up an Andy Warhol for the people to discover. But when it came to music, Bill was self-taught, wasn't he?
Well, actually, he had weekly lessons. At the home in Sharon, Connecticut, they had 5 pianos, and all of the children were required to take piano lessons and to practice 45 minutes every day or every other day. And Bill had a great line in his autobiography where he said, sometimes we didn't know that if it sounded worse with all the pianos playing or just one of the pianos playing. So, but you can imagine being in this kind of house with all of this going on, with this being a priority, this being a pillar that the family said this is a priority for all of the children to experience. And Bill was talented. He and Trish Buckley, it was said, were the 2 most talented of the bunch. And Bill, I heard him play a number of times. He didn't have time to practice. So when the Phoenix Symphony wrote to him and asked him to actually play a Bach concerto for a benefit concert, they gave him 2 years. And Bill asked a friend, Fernando Valenti, the great harpsichordist, which concerto should I learn? Which is the shortest Bach concerto? So Valenti told him the concerto, and Bach, then Bill kind of framed out and planned, over 2 years, I'll need to learn X number of notes every day. And friends of his said, that's not how you learn a piece, right? But his idea and his dedication, he finally did it. He finally played this concerto in 13 months, and then chronicled it on Firing Line. Again, he brought it back to television to show, and how many people did he inspire with something like that, with these kind of moves? That it's possible also, older age, in your 60s, to be able to rekindle a talent from your past and to actually perform something.
But he didn't study music at Yale.
No, he gave it up in his early teens as a goal. He told me, he said, I realized that I wasn't talented enough. And I think there's some evidence out there, and he had often said that maybe the movement's lucky that he wasn't more talented. He was too talented in other things. We'll never know how talented he really was as a pianist. Maybe he just made the right move.
Well, I think part of his conservative vision was, in his vision for a national review, was, okay, people get enough exposure to low culture, what he would have called low culture, just in their everyday lives, but as a conservative, advocating, promoting, drawing attention to high culture, whether it was opera, classical music, classical literature, and here and there art, was part of the mission of conservatives. That's one of the things that conservatives want to conserve and preserve. Is those things that are the pinnacle of culture and good taste, and I think he felt very strongly about that, especially in music. And I think that was his point of view in pushing the back pages as much as he did.
I mean, there's sort of two functions of the back pages in National Review during his editorship. One is to do that job of being a sieve of what is good and what is bad and what's coming out in your day, which is, of course, an incredibly important thing to do. But the readers can be warned away from things that might be polluting of their thought or lying.
Polluting is a good word, yeah.
And then be encouraged on to the things that are actually worth their time. But then there's that second thing of showing what the stuff is that you want to preserve. That's what something else that the back pages of National Review always did. It was this, these are the things you perhaps ought to know if you want to have a rich internal life. And of course, because all of that stuff in high culture requires some work, you need that little bit more encouragement that the work is worth it, because what's on the other side of it is going to be much more worthwhile than the cultural fast food that's otherwise on offer.
And he seemed to me to be a true believer in accessibility, what we call accessibility today, which is more often than not is a cliche, because he really believed that anyone with curiosity and discernment and a good eye or good ears can learn about this stuff and appreciate it and absorb it. Much of the music that he liked originally was not music for super elites. It was music that appealed to a much broader cross-section of humanity.
And he would refer to it as good music. So there's a
It's
distinction.
good music,
Good
yes,
music.
yes.
That was a real point for him.
So what was good music?
Well, good music for Bill was, of course, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, but then there was Elvis, which was a surprise for a lot of people. Elvis in the Morning was
It's
a
a
book.
surprise to me.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
He wrote a novel, Elvis in the Morning, and actually one of my friends was the assistant on that book in Switzerland. He would do these book writing expeditions, and he recounts how Bill would listen to all of this Elvis, and he really loved it. It was in a way for him to connect maybe a little bit to Christopher's childhood and the fact that Christopher, his son, and the fact that he was listening to Elvis. He was listening to all of this music during that era. And Bill came away with a real appreciation for that and wasn't dismissive.
Bill, naturally, because he was a good father, looked at what Christopher was listening to, and of course he wanted to listen to it as well. Part of it is good parroting, but also a big part of it is just a natural curiosity. And I don't know how much Bill focused on jazz or soul music.
He actually really enjoyed jazz as well, and had Dick Westwood, one of the jazz greats, perform at his house, and he had other like Bobby Short, who was at the Carlisle.
Yeah.
He would perform it at the house as well. So when you look at the breadth and scope, I mean, it was, of course, there was a big focus on Bach, on Beethoven, on pianists and harpsichordists, but there was a real testament to others. Peter Duchin, the son of the great band leader and who took over the band, he was a really close friend of the Buckleys. So, of course, from the society set and gala events and everything in New York City, but I think he had an appreciation for something that was good by definition. He saw his friends enjoying it. He saw that there was a point of curiosity and something more than just light fare, right? Or something that was just purely popular.
It's also a sign of a cultured person that they keep their ears open.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a great line in one of his books where he said that it tells you a lot about our society, where you can spend $10 and buy the complete Beethoven sonatas and listen to them for 10 years. So I think
Yeah. Bill's view that culture was the pinnacle of the human enterprise. Great music or great literature, great art was what politics and the free market, the things that were part of his daily life, what they aimed at, because that's what makes great culture possible. Great culture doesn't thrive in the gulag. It doesn't thrive in an oppressive, autocratic society. It prospers in a free society. And I think he was very aware of that.
There's one of the students of the philosopher Leo Strauss once was asked what Strauss's philosophy was, really, and he said it was to make the world safe for philosophy. You can say the same, I think, about Buckley with culture, which is that politics matters, but in part of the reason why politics matters is because the politics has to be right in order to allow the culture to go well. And it's a very interesting other way round from the way a lot of people interested in politics approach it. They're interested in politics because they like politics, or they like the game, or they like power or something. That's quite different from deciding that you must get your hands dirty in politics because the politics has to go right in order for culture to be possible.
and maybe in some ways the back of the book at National Review is what the front of the book is defending. So in a sense,
Well, that's a good point, and I think that's true.
and I think, and maybe in terms of the thinkers, a great culture has great thinkers. A great culture has people who write lengthy articles that people read, books. They have a spirited discussion, but they remain friends. There's a civilized approach, which is lost on us today in many ways, and that's where Firing Line was such a special kind of safe space, we would say today, where people would, for 30 minutes, for an hour, would have a spirited discussion, but then away from the table, they were great
They
friends.
could talk about music or talk about art.
Absolutely.
What did Bill think of opera?
Opera, I don't think opera was as much his thing. I went to several concerts with Bill, but really one that sticks out was St. Thomas Church, going to the St. John Passion by Bach. So that was the most vocal, I think, that I ever really saw Bill. But beyond that, I think his thing was always back to the keyboard and really focused on that, and some orchestral. But there was a fascination. He called, the harpsichord the queen of instruments, and it was an obsession for him. And at the last conversation that I had with Bill, he actually asked me, this was in 2008, and he asked me, do you think that the harpsichord is at its lowest point today in its history? And that tells you something, that one of the very last things that Bill Buckley was thinking about was the harpsichord.
The position of the harpsichord in society.
In society, exactly.
Well, he also knew all about pendulums swinging back and forth.
There's an interesting divide, which I would say always goes along the culture, which is whether or not, to put it in Nietzsche's terms, you're a person of gratitude or a person of resentment. And Nietzsche sees that the only way in which somebody can get out of a life of resentment is to try to be encouraged to have a life of gratitude. And the thing that's so interesting about that, and Buckley obviously understood this innately, I think, is that to live a life of resentment is to live a very unhappy life, because your only answer to things is, why haven't I got X? Why wasn't Y handed to me? And then usually with the final decision, let's burn it all down. And that's, of course, not a very happy life, not least because what happens after the fire is usually worse than the fire. But the alternative, to have a life of gratitude, in order to do it, you have to actually know what it is you've inherited.
Yes.
And that has to be in some way passed on by parents or teachers or anyone else, is to say, look, this is the extraordinary inheritance you've come into. And you could decide, without knowing anything about it, to burn it all down, or you could decide that you're the inheritor of this and your role in life will be deepened and enriched by taking part in it and maybe even adding to it, but at the very least not destroying it. This is an incredibly important insight of certain philosophers, and I think it's an insight that Buckley had, that there was nothing joyful or human really about a life of resentment, whereas a life of gratitude, and it's nothing to do with economics. You can be the richest person in the world and be an incredibly ungrateful person, and you could be the poorest person on earth and yet have thanks for what you have, even the most basic thing, the gift of life, not to be taken for granted. And he understood this, and understood this was something incredibly important to transmit to people.
And he was the least resentful person I think I ever met. Resentment also, it sours the senses so that you can't absorb. You're just not open to great music. You're not open to great art. It's your senses are shrouded by resentment, and I think that was a big part of his thinking also.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the gratitude of Bill for life, for the opportunity to experience everything, his religion really and his faith being the center point, but then also taking a look from that to hear Bach. You know, the idea for him of going through a life of never hearing Bach or reading great literature, or seeing a beautiful painting, or whatever, all those things that our civilization has to offer, it was something that was anathema to what Bill was. And he was the happy warrior, right? He was the one who always had a smile on his face. He was the one who was able to, for some people it was a smirk, but for others it was just this happiness to be alive and to have the opportunity to defend the culture. And that's why everyone invited him on, their programs, late night programs. He was a real celebrity. He was a real popular figure in this sense, but it was also because you saw that gratitude. He wanted to be there. He was happy. What I got from him firsthand was that in spades, I'm grateful to him. He was grateful for the friendship that we had, the music that I was able to play for him and learn for him. But who was I? That's the great equalizer, right? You said it. My parents came with nothing from the Soviet Union, and here was a man who, came from real means, but for him, he saw everyone as an equal. He saw, a friend of mine once said to me, that was the amazing thing about Bill Buckley, that he could talk to a train conductor or to an orchestral conductor, right? he was an everyman in that sense.
It goes back to he was not a snob.
Exactly.
He was an anti-snob. Now, the thing about resentment also, it blocks your senses to beauty.
Yes.
And Bill was a big believer in the primacy of beauty in art, as opposed to anger, disruption, resentment, which is the subject of so much contemporary art.
Yes.
He loved beautiful things.
Well, it's one thing to love beautiful things, but it's another to know why you love them. And in my view, Buckley was one of those people who understood innately that something that's beautiful, a beautiful building, a beautiful person, even a beautiful piece of music, it's not just beautiful, it's telling you something. It's beckoning to you. And it's saying, here is the thing that is the real, maybe even the purpose, the meaning of things. And you've got this little gift that's been given to you, whether it's a piece of music, a painting, or a building. You've been given this gift, and it's luring you. And you should realize that where it's luring you is the place you should be going.
And that gift could have been made 300 years ago,
Yes.
400 years ago, but it's speaking across generations, across years, across
Yes.
cultures, and it's still got that relevance. It still lives even though it's well beyond its age of creation.
And also not taking things for granted. That was a big part of it. I think those things go hand in hand. He said about New York City and all the offerings of New York City that sometimes we find ourselves living in the Grand Canyon with the blinders closed and not realizing.
Yeah, that's a good quote. It's a good point.
In the same way with the gratitude-resentment dichotomy, there's a very interesting difference between people's views of what's gone before them. And Buckley's view was quite rightly that just because somebody went before you doesn't mean that you know more than them. And one of the great mistakes, I would say, that people can slip into is because Plato did not know about molecular structure in the way we do, that we are wiser than Plato, and therefore we should judge Plato and find him wanting. And it's very interesting, whenever you go to a campus in the United States, or almost anywhere in the world, there's always portraits or statues of great men and women of the past. And there's a reason why they're up there. There is a view today that you, the person standing down here, should look up at them and judge them and find them wanting. And that's perfectly possible, because everybody in the past did things that we would not do now, just as we'll probably be doing things now that people after us will be bewildered by. But the other attitude is to say that they're up there and we can judge them, but that's not our only criteria of looking at them. And furthermore, there's an important thing which Buckley and National Review clearly understood, which was sometimes these great figures from the past, great writers, poets, painters and others, they actually judge us. And instead of thinking that, our role is to look at what Shakespeare doesn't address in his plays, maybe we could look at the possibility that Shakespeare judges us and finds us wanting. And that's a completely different view. Do I look up at these things and take what they actually have to give, or do I decide that I can dismiss them all? And the latter is the thing that leads you to a life of resentment, because if you cannot admire what is great, you will be left with merely things that are cultural detritus.
If you look at how National Review itself came into being, Bill was a protege of many great men, and he was a mentor to many who went on in his footsteps, right? So one of the key tenets for me when I look at Bill Buckley is that he was the true mentor, and he was the true protege. So as someone who was a protege of Bill's, and there are many out there, that's what we're grateful for, but we also understand we learn from that. And I think our culture, that's what he has left for us, not to forget the importance of your elders, and maybe your elders will learn from you, but you also need to learn from your elders. And without those elders, he would not have created National Review. He would not have changed the world in many
And that's
ways.
part of conservatism, is you're passing a baton on to younger people. Now, you talked about resentment, which is so important. A counterpoint to Bill, because I think he felt that resentment just was such a waste of time, that you could be spending on music, or you can be spending on art, or you could be spending on beauty, the gifts that culture has given us.
I went sailing a few times with Bill, and it was an incredible experience. And I was never a sailor. I was never very helpful on the sailboat. But he was this aspirational figure, right? So if you look at all of the areas, you look at his spy novels, you look at his book on Elvis Presley, this kind of fictional history of Elvis Presley. You look at his celestial sailing documentary. I mean, this is something that he did in his spare time, or his sailing books of sailing across the Atlantic. this was a full life. Going to Russia as well. He wrote travel stories on going on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So I think that what captured the public imagination then, and it's hard to understand in a sense today, is that he was everywhere, and that it was a zest for life. It comes back to that gratitude. I'm here. I'm going to do all of these things that the world has to offer. I'm not going to sit resentful that I don't have something that someone else has. That's just a waste
He never
of time.
stewed.
No.
He never stewed. And a steward is someone who just misses out on so much of life, so much of the beautiful things in life, like the ocean.
Exactly, and he was so many times called a Renaissance man because he was a Renaissance man, and he wanted to experience each one of those things. He painted. I think he even had a master class once with Marc Chagall, learning how to paint in Switzerland.
Yes, he did.
So this was someone who wanted to search out any opportunity, and he was a little bit like an investigator on culture and wanting a little piece here and there, but the sum of the whole was this extraordinary man.
And part of that comes from, he valued self-improvement so much, and self-discovery, which leads to self-revelation. A concept that was so important to Bill is, okay, New York has great museums, it has great theaters, it has opera, it has something for every taste. He thought that young people, middle-aged people, old people, have to understand that this exists for you. And it doesn't exist anyplace else on earth. A museum exists for you. The doors are open. You can walk in. And you don't have to be an expert. You can draw from it whatever you can if you just keep your mind open to it. That is so important for young people to understand and to run with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for young people where writing a letter is maybe lost upon them in some way, Bill Buckley was one of the great letter writers of the 20th century. When he passed away, 1,000 boxes of correspondence were given to the Yale Library. And those were all kind of stars in the galaxy, in terms of the galaxy that Bill built and that he created. I was the beneficiary. Hundreds of people were the beneficiary of his letters. And I would say to the younger generation that it's so important to search out a mentor, search out someone who is your hero, and take a chance and write them a letter, because they can change your life.
He also was a most unorthodox letter writer. He wrote those letters in the bottle, which I didn't know.
I didn't know that story either. I mean, about
Well, tell it.
about throwing anti-communist messages at dinner parties off of the boat.
Yeah, so you don't know what impact you're going to have.
And the idea is going to float, it might land on the shores of Soviet Russia and be opened by...
Or North Korea.
Or North Korea.
North Korea.
It's very important, that point you made. Quite often people say, that they see people in their lives and they say that this person was lucky in the people they knew. That can be the case, but more often it's not luck. It's people making their own luck. It's people making their own ways, seeing people who they admire and then gravitating towards them and seeing what happens. And the great thing about that is that it's a symbiotic relationship, that the pupil approaching, as it were, has the opportunity for doors to be opened to them of understanding and of much more. And that's obviously got multiple benefits of its own, but for the person who's willing to open the door, this has an enormous benefit as well, because you can see this. It goes back to the happy warrior element of Buckley. You can see this is that if you were a pessimist about the culture, you would not bother reseeding the field. If you are optimistic about the future and of good ideas and good art winning out, of course you encourage it, of course you nurture it, because you see that if you reseed the field, it'll blossom after you've gone.
And we've seen that in so many ways.